Hi, I'm Tim. Join me in this video as I go over touch and goes for your radio control model aircraft, how we do them, why we do them, and why they can make you a better pilot. Let's get to it. Setting goals is always a good thing to do when you fly, to include flying your RC model airplanes. When we go to the field, we often do the same flights time after time. It's always good to try something different. It could be acrobatics, but what I'd like to discuss in this video is how you can work to practice touch and go landings with your radio control model airplane. By practicing touch and goes, you'll be a better pilot on the landing. It'll give you something to shoot for. You'll be able to easily grade the landings based on your touchdown point on the runway, and overall it'll just make you a better, more confident pilot. For this video, we'll be using the Livewire Champ. It was a plane designed back in the 1950s. At the time, it was by Bolt was the designer. It was the most popular RC trainer kit in America. The reason I picked the Livewire Champ is it's big enough to see, it's heavy enough to fly through a few bumps in the air, and it just flies well. It's a 3-channel model. I got it from Lozano Laserworks. I'll put the link in the description if you'd like to build one for yourself. Very, very happy with this kit, but this is the plane we'll be using to practice our touch and goes. Also, at the end of the video, or near the end, I'll do several touch and goes with the Livewire Champ. You'll be able to see how it behaves. Some of the approach is good, some not so good. I'll give commentary on that so you can see some examples of touch and go landings with an RC model airplane. First, let's discuss a typical aircraft landing pattern. This is what we fly mostly at our airfields. It's a rectangular pattern. A downwind is parallel to the landing runway. You're going down the wind. A turn to the left, you'll fly your base leg. This is 90 degrees to the runway. And then the final 90-degree turn is on final, where you're lining up onto the runway. There are generally two types of patterns, left or right-hand patterns. It depends which direction you turn in. In this example, we'll be using standard patterns with left-hand turns. Part of any landing, to include touch and goes, is having an aim point on the runway to aim for. Standard instrument approach runways have very clear markings for the touchdown point. The idea is you're in the clouds when you're shooting your approach. When you break out, you could be as close as 200 feet from the ground. You want to have a very clear understanding where you are in that particular runway in terms of length. There are aim points, there are 500-foot markers, and so forth, and I'll show you a picture up top of one of those runways. What we can do for our RC model airplanes is go ahead and just pick an aim point on the runway, some point near where you can see the model landing that gives you sufficient room to roll out, but is a aim point that you consistently plan to hit on your landings. This will just improve your overall accuracy and proficiency with landings, to include the touch and goes. An important part of any landing pattern is compensating for the wind. Normally we don't care too much about the wind when we fly, but we're trying to make a specific ground track over the ground. The wind will affect us. So assuming that the wind is going straight down the runway, when we're flying our downwind, we should be not have to make any corrections to say a certain distance aligned off of the runway on the downwind. Once we turn onto the base pattern, we have to establish what we call a crab, which is a slight heading into the wind, such that you can do a 90-degree straight line to the final approach course. If we don't compensate for the wind with a crab, we'll be blown further away from the runway. It's not the end of the world for the landing pattern, but we want to get into the habit of establishing crab into the wind to fly whatever ground track we want to do. In this discussion, when we turn final and we're lined up directly into the wind on your final approach to the runway, the wind is right down the runway. There's no crab angle required. However, if the wind is a crosswind of any sort, we will have to establish a crab pointed into the wind such that we can fly a straight ground path on the final approach to the runway. The amount of crab is just part of piloting. It depends how fast you're going, how much the wind is blowing. The wind can vary. The bottom line is you just have to do enough crab that you're sufficient to correct for the wind blowing you downwind, that you fly a straight line into the runway. So let's discuss touch and goes. What are touch and goes? Touch and goes are a practice landing approach where a pilot flies an airplane, they actually touch down on the runway, they're still moving right along. Once they have touched down, in other words, completed the landing phase, You apply full power, configuration is necessary, then you take off again. The reason light aircraft practice touch and goes is just a way to save money. You need to learn how to do your approaches and touchdowns in the early stages of flight. You can get a lot more of these touchdowns and approaches by doing touch and goes in a given hour of flight time than if you had to do a full stop to taxi back, or if you have a long enough runway, you can do a full stop on the runway, then take off for the remaining distance. So again, it's just a practice to efficiently use your flight time, to learn the approach and touchdown phase of flight for light aircraft. Touch and goes are rarely, almost never used for airline traffic unless there's some really weird qualification that has to be done. The reason is it's very expensive to do touch and goes with the more complicated aircraft. It's hard on the gear, brakes, tires, and so forth. Plus the simulators are very good. You can get just about all of the knowledge you need in a simulator, and the assumption is by the time you're in an airliner, you know how to land an aircraft. Whatever understanding has to be done can be done in the full aircraft during flight. So again, touch and goes are just a way to efficiently use flight time, and it's good to practice them on our RC models because every takeoff will result in a landing, and it's good just to practice your approaches that you're confident and can line up with the correct approach to hit the correct touchdown point. This thing on touch and goes is especially important for your heavier aircraft where you do have to make allowances for the approach. With lighter aircraft, it kind of plunk down, it's not so much. A good example is my F-22, four-board F-22. Just literally take that over the end of the runway, reduce the power, it comes straight down, but that's a unique situation. What I'd like to do now is give a short discussion on pitch and power regarding airspeed and altitude. And this is an approach that I feel is helpful for flying any light aircraft, model aircraft. It's more applicable to the heavier aircraft than the lightweight ones. I'll use this as an example for the discussion. But as a general rule, to understand airspeed, what controls your airspeed on an airplane is your pitch angle. In other words, if you're a little bit slow, and I'll use this as an example, and you want to go faster, the best thing to do is to lower the nose and you will gain airspeed. A good way to visualize this is pretend you're in an airplane like this, a glider, or a regular airplane where the engine is lost. If you see the airspeed getting low, you have no engine power, and you want to go faster, the thing to do is to lower the nose and you will gain airspeed. So what I approach flying is whenever I see a model on flying a real airplane, if I'm slow, I instinctively lower the nose initially to start gaining airspeed. What power will do will control your altitude. So in other words, if I am slow and I lower the nose, I'll gain airspeed. I'm obviously losing altitude. As you add power, that will tend to reduce the altitude loss. Clearly, the pitch and the power are interrelated, but a good way to approach it is lower the nose to increase the airspeed as power needed as necessary to decrease the descent rate. So in other words, in low power, you might go down like this. If you add some power, it'll be a more gradual descent angle. By keeping that clear in your mind, you'll have a better feel for flying your airplane. And keep in mind, if you do someday have to glide in for a dead stick landing, not as common these days with electric engines, but if you're dead stick, the only thing to allow you to increase the airspeed is to lower the nose. And so this will flow right into that. So again, pitch for airspeed, throttle for altitude, and that will help on your landing approaches. There are three things you can practice in preparation for getting good on your touch and go landings. The first one is what we call slow flight. The second one is understanding a crabbed final approach. And the third one is flying a nice square rectangular pattern. So let's go through those one by one. Slow flight is a thing that is normally practiced by full-scale pilots, maybe not so much by radar control model pilots, but what will happen is if you're flying your RC model in your normal cruise flight, let's just say the speed of the model is 40 miles an hour and you're flying at 2/3 throttle, full throttle, whatever your throttle setting is. So you're very comfortable flying the aircraft at that power setting and at that airspeed. But what will happen is when you start to practice your landings, especially on final approach, you'll be flying slower than 40 miles an hour. Let's just pick a speed of 20 miles an hour. In other words, you'll be practicing slow flight on final approach. Slow flight is a regime of flight that you should be very comfortable flying, but we have to be a little bit careful because as we slow down, especially for landing, we're getting close to the stalling speed of the airplane. And so it is possible if you get a little bit too slow, you could stall out the airplane or get the beginning of a stall, which is what we don't want. So we practice slow flight. What we do for slow flight is it's very easy. At a comfortable altitude, fly the airplane in front of you at the model airplane field and reduce the throttle to pretty close to an idle power setting. The model will obviously descend because you reduce the power. And what you do is slowly increase the nose pitch angle. Remember, pitch controls airspeed till it slows down till you're at a slow flight that you think would be appropriate to fly final approach at. The nose will be slightly high. If the model's still descending, remember throttle controls altitude, add some power such that we can visualize the pitch setting and the throttle setting for level flight at slow speed. Now remember, when you're going slower, you're a little bit closer to a stall speed. If you raise the nose too much, it could begin a stall. And what we want to do is just get comfortable flying at slow flight. We can practice maneuvers, perhaps a 360-degree turn in front of you at this slower airspeed, and reduce the throttle slightly so you can get used to descending at this airspeed, pretending you're on a final approach, and just visualizing the pitch angle to practice slow flight. The other thing I mentioned before with the wind is the crab. When you're flying on final, if this is the final approach course, if the wind is coming at me, if we don't make any correction, the model will be blown towards me in this discussion and off the extended center line of the runway. So what we do is we crab or just turn a few degrees into the wind such that for every bit the wind blows you down, you're crabbing this way. Even though the airplane's heading is not aligned with the runway, it's tracking a straight ground path into the runway. This is very important for crosswind landings. If you can get the habit of properly crabbing into the wind, wings level, it's just a normal flight, crabbing in, slow flight descending, you'll track straight into the runway and be all set for a touchdown. The crabbing is a normal thing that's used for full-scale aircraft, especially jet transports. Depending on the aircraft type, for example, the 777, the engines are quite low to the ground. You can't do the wing low side slip technique too much depending on the wind. And it is okay to touch down in the crab and align the aircraft as you're rolling out. With RC models, if you touch down in the crab, it's really no big deal whatsoever. And I can show you a picture here shortly of a airliner crabbing on final approach. It looks very strange, even though the aircraft heading is not aligned with the runway. Because the pilot is crabbing into the wind, the aircraft is tracking straight in on the center line. It is a normal and safe way to approach in crosswind conditions if you're within crosswind limits. And the final practice exercise for patterns and touch and goes is flying a square pattern. So in other words, you take off from the runway, your first left turn is what we call a crosswind. You turn to a downwind where you're flying parallel to the runway, base turn, then final. You can practice at altitude, just flying a nice square pattern, correcting for the wind or the crab as you go around. Just getting used to flying your aircraft in slow flight with ground reference, a nice square pattern. That will help you from preventing you from overshooting final and just fly a better pattern for your touch and go landings. So the next thing to think about as you're doing touch and goes or any landing is what is referred to as a stabilized approach. The FAA talks about a stabilized approach. You're on a pre-planned descent angle to a predetermined touchdown point on the runway. That is a stabilized approach. In other words, you're not going like this on final. You're at a land descent angle aiming for a planned touchdown point on the runway. When you fly for airlines or full-scale aircraft, there are other things to do with a stabilized approach. You should be at an appropriate power setting, fully configured, checklist complete, no more than 1,000 foot per minute rate of descent. If any of these conditions are not met, the approach is not stabilized. You're still trying to sort something out, which is the last thing you want to be doing on a short final, generally anything within 5 nautical miles of the runway. So we can help ourselves by striving wherever possible to fly a stabilized approach. Of course, it'll depend on the model, it'll depend on the wind. You will go up and down a little bit on final, but if you can keep that a straight stabilized approach to your predetermined aim point on the runway. That will help a lot with improving the quality and accuracy of your landings for your RC model airplane. Towards the end of this video, we will go through a few videos of my touch and goes. Normally the touchdown point is within the first third of the runway, closer towards the end. In this case, the touchdown point's a little bit closer to where I'm standing on the runway, just so we can get a better film angle of the touchdown point for this aircraft. Another thing to mention with landings, as we're talking about landings, is we focus a lot on the approach and landing, but part of any landing approach is a planned go-around. So a go-around is just where you're on the ground or very close to landing. There's some thing that's wrong. It could be somebody walking onto the airfield. It could be another plane that didn't clear the runway, and you have to go around to prevent hitting that aircraft or that person. The go-around should be in the planning part for any sort of approach. If you want to terminate the approach and go around, with RC models, it's very simple. We just add power, raise the nose to begin to climb out. If it's a heavy model with flaps, you might want to go to takeoff flap setting. Raise the gear once you have a positive rate of climb, and that way we can just get out of the way of a potential accident. Also, it could be that you're doing a landing, the landing's just going horribly, it's not going well at all, and you wish to abort that landing. Just be in the habit, the mindset. If it doesn't look right, if it doesn't look safe, just go around so you don't scare anybody, impact off the flight line. Just get it back in the air, set up again to do another landing. And again, the whole point of this practice with touch and goes is that you're more comfortable in the landing pattern, and you can be prepared for this eventuality of a go-around if it has to happen. The final item before we start reviewing some of the videos of the touch and goes is the use of flaps. If an airplane has flaps, the flaps do two things. They add drag and they increase the lift of the wing. So with any high-performance aircraft, fighter, airline transport, and so forth, the flaps are a needed part of the configuration to land. If you don't have the flaps, the plane is just going too fast. It's not descending quick enough to really safely land. So I'll show you a diagram of landing with flaps. It just gives you a steeper approach. So when you have flaps, understand that you'll have a different final approach angle than a model without flaps. And what this will do will allow you to fly slower with your slow flight. It'll have a steeper, still safe approach angle to the runway, and just a tighter landing pattern with the use of flaps. So now let's take a look at a few of my touch and goes, and I'll give some commentary on what I see as I'm doing these touch and goes with the Livewire. Here's the first of 3 touch and goes coming in. This is definitely not a stabilized approach. I'm going up and down. It's me, the thumbs, that are doing that. And it's hard to recover with a decent touch and go after that type of an approach. But we touch down, add power, and we go around. Second pattern is a little bit better. Again, it's a little bit fast, the ground speed, because we're flying with a bit of tailwind for the camera angle, but a good touchdown. The third approach, a much more stabilized approach. Again, a little bit of the tailwind, so the ground speed's fast, but you can see on the touchdown, it's at a fairly low airspeed. It's flying about where it should be for this touch and go. So one other thing to think about when you are flying is back in the old days with gas engines, it was quite common to have a dead stick landing at some point, dead stick being slang for the engine is no longer working. So whether you liked it or not, when a gas motor quit, you did not have any more power, and you had to figure out how to get back to the field and land safely. Again, this is very important where the pitch controls the airspeed, so you don't have throttle anymore. You've got to keep the nose low enough to maintain a safe and proper airspeed. You may be landing crosswind, usually across the runway. Very often, if you had a dead stick landing, you would shout out dead stick so everybody knew it. They could clear the airfield. But even though dead sticks are much less of a problem these days with electric flight, it's always a good training exercise to be wherever you are at some point in the flight. Simulate that you've lost your engine, pull it back, the engine to idle, even the electric motor, and just see how it works out trying to get back to the airfield using pitch and maintain proper airspeed, understanding the descent angles of your aircraft from your slow flight practice to try to safely land on the runway. Thank you for watching this video on the touch and goes. You heard the commentary as I did the touch and goes. Touch and goes are good practice. It's an objective you can do each time you come out to the field. Everybody has to land after every flight. It's just good to get into practice on it. There was a little bit of a crosswind today, which makes it challenging for the landing, especially the go-around, because you're slow and the wind's blowing you across the runway. But by practicing the touch and goes, you just practice your approaches, your landings, you'll just be a better pilot for doing that. So good luck at the RC field.